Sean Desh Cogardas Goal Cood, and I wish you well in the work. We're coming into pre-budget mode, and we know that departments and ministers are looking at figures at this stage. We've had a number of pre-budget submissions, attended pre-budget presentations, and we know the National Economic Dialogue is on today, and just listening to various figures that are being bandied about, and I was just struck by one headline, which was government in budgetary straitjacket. And there's going to be a lot of demands on whatever is available, and very justifiable demands, and decisions are going to have to be made, and I would hope that the decisions will be about making the biggest difference that is possible. And I'm looking in particularly about inequality in society, and one group who experience inequality in a more acute way than anybody else, and that's people with a disability. Now, I do acknowledge what you and Minister Harris and Minister McGrath did recently to get people with a disability into employment in making work pay report, but there are a lot of recommendations in that are still to be implemented. People with a disability tell us that they and us are a long way from the kind of society in which they would like to live, and the facts speak for themselves. For example, a February survey on income and living conditions showed that overall general poverty rates in Ireland are showing some improvements, but they're getting worse for people with a disability. People with a disability are at almost twice the risk of living in poverty as the general population. Half of all people with disability have extra costs, and they have been estimated at €207 per week for some people with a disability. They're also facing housing problems, with fewer wheelchair-accessible houses being built. Householders headed by people with a disability, they're twice as likely to experience unemployment as other households, and when it comes to levels of consistent poverty, people with a disability suffer more than those without a disability. We also know about the poor educational outcomes for people with a disability, and we know that many of them are dependent on social welfare as their only source of income, and that's not to mention the various cuts that they have suffered in recent budgets. So it's a very unequal world for people with a disability. So what I'm asking is to consider in this budget that instead of giving a little to many, which might not make an appreciable difference in their lives, that there's an opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of those with a disability, and that Budget 18 will be a concerted effort to address the poverty and the exclusion that is experienced by many people with a disability and their families.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, and I'd also like to thank you very much for acknowledging that the recent statistics from 2015 do show that consistent poverty is down and that income inequality is narrowing, albeit still much worse than where we were before the crisis, but it's going in the right direction, and I acknowledge the fact that you acknowledge that, because I think often people don't acknowledge that. But you are absolutely right to say that people with disabilities suffer enormous disadvantage and enormous inequalities in our society, and we have very much more to do to improve living conditions and opportunities for them. In the last budget, the budget for 2017, there was a considerable increase in funding for disability services. If I remember off the top of my head, I think it was in the region of 60 million. I'm sure we'll find room for a further increase in funding for disability services for next year, not least in the area of respite, which I think is hugely important in giving people a break and giving carers a break in particular. We also had in the social welfare package from March the first increase in weekly payments paid to people with disabilities and their carers in, I think, 8 or 9 years. And I'm not sure if that's going to be possible again next year, but I hope that it will be. And as you mentioned in our Making Work Pay report, a number of measures were introduced to assist people with disabilities to re-enter the workforce or enter the workforce. So, for example, as Minister for Social Protection, I extended the free travel pass for 5 years to anyone who is on disability allowance and takes up work. Minister Harris is currently working on changes to the medical card thresholds to ensure that people on disability allowance and similar payments, if they do take up work, don't lose their medical card, because that's an enormous fear that people with disabilities have, is that they earn a bit more money. That'll be wiped out by the fact that they lose their medical card. We'd hoped to have that legislation through this year, which I think will encourage more people to take up work if they can. We've also set the target in government departments and public agencies to provide 6% of all jobs to people with disabilities, because people who have disabilities, particularly people with severe disabilities like blindness, they find it very hard to get through interview processes. So one thing we discussed at Cabinet just this week and agreed to fast track was a dedicated entry stream for people with disabilities into employment in government departments and government agencies, so that they can increase their opportunities to enter employment. And also, in addition to that, my previous department, the Department of Social Protection, is going to run a campaign, an information campaign in the coming months, informing people with disabilities of the opportunities and entitlements now available to them, and the fact that they can take a trial of work, knowing that their disability allowance will be restored if the trial of work doesn't work out, because many people with disabilities do fear that if they take up employment and it doesn't work out, they'll have a difficulty getting back on welfare, and we're going to give them an assurance that that isn't the case.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thank you. I mean, we're talking about some 600,000 people, which is about 13% of the population. Yesterday we had a meeting in the AV room which was looking at disability being one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the call was made for our aid to be disability inclusive. There is one glaring omission, and that is that Ireland has still not signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. And at this point we're the only country in the EU who has not signed. Now, we did have a roadmap to ratification, but that roadmap has turned into a very, very long road. Now, ratification would be an indication of how important this issue is to the government. And you know, even a slight tweaking of the corporate tax would provide all of the resources necessary so that people with a disability can participate and contribute fully equally in society. And that also means protecting the services that allow independent living. So my question here is, will we see ratification by the 3rd of December this year, which is the International Day for Persons with a Disability?
I should add to the actions that I mentioned earlier, the fact that children in receipt of domiciliary care allowance are now automatically entitled to a medical card. So 10,000 children who didn't receive a medical card previously now have it as an automatic right. I really want to pay tribute to the work of Minister Harris and Mr McGrath in that regard. And 30,000 young people with disabilities under the age of 16 in receipt of domiciliary care allowance are no longer subject to any reviews between receiving DCA and reaching the age of 16. So I think that's some real progress with regard to the supports that the state offers people with disabilities. In relation to the convention, I share your frustration that it's taken so long to ratify it. We do have a different approach to other countries. That convention, for example, has been ratified by Romania and Italy. I don't think anyone would argue that people with disabilities are less disadvantaged in Romania or Italy than they are in Ireland. But the approach that other countries follow is they ratify and implement later, whereas we like to implement all the legal provisions first and therefore ratify, which is a much more meaningful approach. But we are considering making an exception on this occasion for this particular convention because it is taking so long to ratify it, and we are going to have a meeting quite soon involving the key ministers and the AG to see if we can adopt a different approach, because we absolutely want to have the convention ratified by December 3rd, as you say.